Daniel chapter 2 this morning. Daniel chapter 2. We've got a lot of ground to cover and a very short amount of time to cover it this morning. So I'm going to jump right in. We're Daniel chapter 2. We started talking last week, the series titled Undefeated. It doesn't mean you don't experience some setbacks, but undefeated means that, ultimately, whether you experience setbacks or not, you're going to win. And that's the thing that we really see. It's a theme that we really see repeated in the first half of the book of Daniel. And it starts off with the fall of Jerusalem in this really weird place to start kind of a book or a section of a book on victory entitled Undefeated. Let's lose our capital city. Let's make our king a vassal. And let's carry away a bunch of captives. And that was actually the good place from which started. And yet we find as Daniel 1 draws to a close that Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, have managed to stand out, not just among the men who were responsible for training them, but even before King Nebuchadnezzar himself took note of these four guys, that they were superior. And so rather than being sent back to Israel as bureaucrats, essentially, he keeps them in Babylon with him to serve as advisors, to serve as administrators there in his kingdom. And so that's kind of where we pick up going into chapter 2. And it's kind of an unrelated story, and yet we see Daniel and his friends still there and still having a key role. The chapter 2 begins with trouble. There's some trouble in Babylon, and it's an unusual thing. Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Now, in and of itself, that's not that unusual. You ever had a dream, and you woke up, and then you couldn't get back to sleep? You know what that's like? That's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. So this is not that odd of a thing, but his spirit was very troubled. He couldn't sleep, and so he wanted to know, this dream. And just like any one of us, if you have a weird dream and it wakes you up, you tend to spend the rest of your night thinking about what did that dream mean. Now that dream may have just meant you should have maybe skipped that last pizza before you went to bed. And sometimes it's just your subconscious brain trying to untangle the tangled threads of your life. And so, you can only put so much credibility in dreams. But Nebuchadnezzar has one, and understandably it's troubled him, and understandably then he wants to know what's going on. And he makes this really kind of troubling decision in verse 2. The king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. Now, this part is not unusual. In Babylonian culture, for the king to have a dream and then to call in the collective wise men of Babylon to interpret the dream for him. So far, we're on pretty familiar territory for him, but he gets unfamiliar quickly. The king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give him the interpretation. So far, everything's normal. Tell us what your dream was. We'll tell you what it means. This is their job. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is, what's the next word there? Firm. He had made a decision about how he was going to handle this, and he wasn't going to be dissuaded. He said, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut to pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. He says, so here's the ground rules for today's exercise, boys and girls. Not only are you going to tell me the interpretation of the dream, you're going to tell me what I dreamed. I'm not going to tell you, you're going to tell me. And so he wanted to validate that they knew what was going on. Anybody can make anything sound good. Okay, here's what this means. He says, you tell me what I dreamed, and you tell me the interpretation of the dream. Instantly, it's like pulling the rug out from underneath the feet of these guys. Interpreting the dreams, they were fine. Actually telling you what you dreamed and then interpreting it, this is not something that's normal in Babylonian life. And they immediately begin hemming and hawing. Verse 6. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. It's like round and round and round we go, and where we stop, nobody knows. He says, you tell me the dream, and you tell me the interpretation, and I'll reward you. If you don't, I'm going to hack you to death. And they're like, okay, king, you just tell us the dream, and we'll give you the interpretation. And you can see him going, I don't think you understand. I'm not telling you the dream. You're telling me the dream and the interpretation. Okay, king, just tell us what you dreamed, and we'll tell you the interpretation. Like, which part aren't you getting? So there's a little bit of a breakdown in communication here in Babylon, but again, they're besides themselves. They really don't know what to do with this situation except for keep trying to push it back to normal, and it's not going back to normal. The king in verse 8 answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. He says, yeah, I know what you're doing. You're just trying to keep me talking here to get me to change my mind. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. He goes, you guys quit stalling for time. Tell me the dream, and then I'll know that the interpretation is right. But if you can't tell me the dream, there's only one fate for you. It's decided. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. He said, no king on earth has ever been this unreasonable. No king on earth would ever expect his counselors to tell him the dream, just the interpretation. You're doing something that nobody else is doing here. Again, still trying to push their advantage, or trying to save their lives, really. Verse 11, it is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other one who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. They're like, look, you just called the wrong group of things. You don't need a counselor. You don't need a wise man. You need a God. Because what you're asking is beyond mortal ability to do. No person could do what you're asking to do. Only a God could do this. You get the sense they might be a tad desperate at this point? I mean, they're walking a pretty fine line with the emperor, right? For this reason, in verse 12, the king was angry and very furious and gave command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So, I mean, this is a lot of trouble going on in Babylon. These guys are besides themselves, and the king is furious because all they did was stall for time. All they did was prove that they don't know the answer. He already knew they didn't know the answer, and all they did was prove themselves to be frauds and charlatans. And so he says, fine, I'm done with all of you, and he issues the decree. Start killing these guys. And you can imagine where the bloodletting probably began was right there, because there were some assembled guys ready to roll, literally. And so the decree goes out, and the army mobilizes, and they start hunting down astrologers and Chaldeans and soothsayers and all of the wise men and advisors to the king. And they're going hunting. Lots of trouble in Babylon. Not a good day to be a counselor to the king. And it's noted that they start looking for Daniel and his three friends, because what's their role? They're advisors to the king. So that's where the story kind of transitions as we get down to verse 14. We get some conferences begin to happen. You get a whole bunch of conferences that take place back and forth, as you might imagine. There's a little bit of intrigue here. There's a little bit of people conferring, trying to figure out what to do next. I mean, the king has made a decree. It's pretty clear what needs to happen, but let's see what we can do. Then with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch. Now, what's interesting, that verse is a brutal transition from verse 13. Because what you don't see is you see the king make the command, and you see the army going out to start hunting. But what you don't see, and what's assumed here in verse 14, is that Arioch, who is introduced to us as the captain of the king's guard, actually seeks out Daniel to confer with him. Because here you have Daniel answering Arioch. So the whole first half of that conversation we missed, but there was a conversation that started taking place. What it looks like is that Arioch was at least, either friends with Daniel or respected Daniel enough to say, maybe he'll have an idea, because this is a bad day. If we start killing all of the king's counselors, there's not going to be anybody left to counsel the king, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And so Arioch is exercising some wisdom here. They're out slowly, I think, killing the king's advisors, hunting them down and rounding them up, but he's off talking to Daniel to figure out what can be done. And so with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answers Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree from the king so urgent?" So they're having a conference. They're having a discussion here. Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel wasn't there for this whole thing. So Arioch, who is now relating to Daniel all that we already read, the first 13 verses there, what happened, what transpired in the king's court that's got the king so furious with practically everybody. So he relates the thing to him. So Daniel then, hearing this, actually seeks a conference with the king. In verse 16, Daniel went in and he asked the king to give him time that he might tell the king the interpretation. Interesting, you have the wise men who were there, the Babylonian advisors that Nebuchadnezzar already had. They're out there stalling for time. They're out there accusing the king of doing something that no king had ever done, and they're just dragging their feet, stalling, trying to find some way to gain time. And the king even knew that. He said, "You're just asking for time to save your own neck." Daniel walks into Nebuchadnezzar, and what's the thing that he directly asks for? Time. But he's honest about it. He says, "Hey, would you give us some time, and we'll get you the dream and the interpretation." But rather than dragging his feet, and rather than trying to push this back at the king like he's being unreasonable, he says, "That's your instruction? That's fine. I just need a little bit of time to sort this out." And so this kind of frontal approach with the king actually is far more effective than dragging your feet. And so the king actually gives him some time to do it. So Daniel then calls a conference with his three friends, and they confer together, and the point of them meeting is so that they might pray together. In verse 17, then Daniel went to his house, and he made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. They were motivated. They're saying, "God, we are praying that you will tell us what the king dreamed, that you will tell us what it means, because we don't want to die." So there's some motivation. When your life is on the line, are you motivated? They're motivated, man. They're praying their brains out because they understand that this is not a normal request, but it doesn't matter to the king if it's normal or not. He's already made the decision. And he's the king, and who's going to challenge him? Which soldier's going to say, "King, you're being unreasonable, let's not kill people"? No, he pays them to kill people, and so that's what they're going to do. And so Daniel and his friends, they are praying, "Lord, give us the interpretation. We don't want to die." But God is intreatable. God answers prayer, especially motivated prayers, but he answers prayer in general. We get to verse 19. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So God actually reveals to Daniel the dream. Now, it's an interesting thing. Daniel's in this awkward place because one of the things that we learned about Daniel in the end of chapter 1 is that God gifted him with a supernatural ability to interpret dreams. And so the interpretation of a dream was not something that Daniel was normally want to struggle with. It was a gift that God had given him. But knowing a dream that you didn't hear and didn't have and weren't told, even Daniel, that's a long shot. And so he's off praying, "God, I need you to tell me what the dream is, and the interpretation would be good too." And so God, in the middle of the night, as they're praying together, gives Daniel a positive answer to that request, tells him what the dream was and the interpretation. And so Daniel says in verse 20 then, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings." And this whole response of Daniel will make better sense later as we get into what the dream was. But right now, he's just having church. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. "I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked you, for you have made known to us the king's demand." And so this all works out very well. Daniel gets the answer to the question that he had. And so Daniel then confers again with Nebuchadnezzar. Or actually, he's going to confer first with Arioch. "Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, 'Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation.'" So you get the feeling in this that Arioch is, he's doing his job, but he's not doing it as quickly as one might hope. Or not doing it as quickly as he possibly could, kind of dragging his feet. And so Daniel goes to Arioch. He's like, "All right, stop killing people. I got the answer. Just take me to the king." So Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said thus to him, "I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation." So it's interesting. Here's Daniel. He's serving as a counselor to the king. He's serving as an administrator in the Babylonian Empire, and yet here's Arioch, who respects him. He's introducing him still as, "Hey, I got one of those Jewish captive kids. One of those guys that you brought over from Jerusalem and you trained them." Now, it's kind of weird because a lot of the people that served Nebuchadnezzar weren't necessarily native Babylonians. Babylon was kind of a melting pot in the ancient world, much like America is today. And they would have had people from other nations that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered, people who had been trained, people who had been entrusted, that could be brought in council. So it's odd a little bit that Arioch would introduce Daniel as one of those captives from Judah, as opposed to a captive from someplace else. But that's how he introduces him. Verse 26. "The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, 'Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?'" Let's cut right to the chase. "Do you know what I dreamed, and do you know what it means?" Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets." That's huge. He's like, this is a God thing, and I'm a God man, so we'll sort this out. "And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came to your mind while on your bed about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be." So the kind of the cause of all this is that Nebuchadnezzar, before he went to bed, was thinking about, I wonder what the future is going to look like. I wonder what the future holds. I wonder what's going to come after my life, after my empire. I wonder what that's going to look like. And Daniel says, you were wondering what the future was going to look like, and God answered for you. That's what your dream was. Your dream was God's answer, what the future looks like. Verse 30. "But as for me, the secret has not been revealed to me, because I have more wisdom than anyone living, but for our sakes who made known the interpretation of the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart." And Daniel says, look, I'm not smarter than anybody else. God just gave me the interpretation to keep me alive, for starters, and two, because he actually wants you to understand the answer he gave you. How often is it that God gives us an answer and we just don't understand the answer? You ever been there? You're like, I think he just answered the question, but I don't get it. And so, the answer brings more questions. But God actually wanted him to understand, and so Daniel goes. So verse 31. And we get in verse 31, we start to see the answer, and we see the dream was of this great image. "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff which the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So there's what Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. You can see why that might be a little unsettling. You can see why, he didn't even have pizza, and so that's not the issue. You can understand why that would be a little troubling. That must mean something, but I have no idea what it means. So that's what kind of got Nebuchadnezzar going. Verse 36, then, Daniel gives him the meaning of the dream. He said, "This is the dream. Now we will tell you the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold." And so he starts off with this great interpretation of this head of gold, and he says, "You, Nebuchadnezzar, and you being the king of Babylon, Babylon is the head of gold." And he gives him that. Now we think about this head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar had built a wonderful and incredible empire, but the Babylonian Empire would only last for about 66 years. Very short-lived kind of global dominance, but they were this head of gold, and that's the way God described it. If we keep reading, where am I? Verse 39. I just lost my place. There it is. "But after you shall rise another kingdom inferior to yours." And so he alludes, though he doesn't say, that you've got this other kingdom. You have this kingdom who was the chest and the arms of silver. Historically, that's a reference to the Medo-Persian Empire. Media-Persia came after the Babylonian Empire. I think the two arms could signify the two parts of that empire, Media and Persia. It was a combined peoples. It was a combined empire, but they overtook Babylon. The Medio-Persian Empire was built by Cyrus the Great, and it lasted for about 208 years. So it's a little bit bigger than the head of gold that was there. So he said, "After you shall rise another kingdom inferior to yours." It's interesting that the word inferior there, because the Medo-Persian Empire was actually larger than the Babylonian Empire. But one of the things that you could see is from a moral perspective, they were inferior. You get more people, you have more sinful tendencies, you have more wickedness, and morally they just didn't come up as far as Babylon did. So he gets this kingdom that's going to be inferior to yours, and then a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And so after the empire of Media-Persia came another empire. Historically, that was the empire of Greece. And that is this torso and belly of bronze. That was the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire was built by Alexander the Great. Only lasted for about 185 years, but still this world empire. They ruled the entire world in their day. And as they got bigger, they seemed to get inferior too, morally speaking. And the fourth kingdom, in verse 40, shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Historically, we're speaking about the empire of Rome now being these two legs of iron. And certainly that is a description of the Roman Empire. They literally just crushed everything that was in their path. They swept aside Greece like they weren't even there. They obliterated the entire territory. They really did rule the entire known world in their day, or the entire civilized world. Of course, they defined civilization, so it's easier to rule. But they were built, and Rome is these two legs, and the two legs signify the two parts of the Roman Empire. We a lot of times think of a unified Roman Empire, and there was for about 500 years actually a unified Roman Empire. But then it broke into two pieces: the Western Roman Empire, which continued to be known as the Roman Empire, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which some people know as the Empire of Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire, but that was just the Eastern Roman Empire. And so you have the unified Roman Empire lasting for 500 years. The Western Roman Empire actually lasted all the way to the year 476 AD, and the Eastern Roman Empire made it all the way to the year 1345. So, I mean, this was a large, long-lasting empire that ruled over great swaths of land for the better part of 2 millennia. Not too bad. And so you have these two legs of iron. In verse 41, whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdoms shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. Now let me stop there. He's talking about in the days of those 10 kings, represented by those 10 toes that are a mixture of iron and clay that don't mix well. They're going to be a little bit strong and they're going to be a little bit fragile. You say, what kingdom is that? I haven't the slightest idea. It hasn't got here yet. And so what we see is the influence of the Roman Empire really continues to be felt all the way through our day. Western civilization was built on the foundation of the Roman Empire. Our political system, our scientific systems, everything that we have today in Western society is built on the foundation of Roman civilization. And so that has in some measure continued to our day. Future to us, and prophecy talks about this in other places, in Daniel, Revelation, the minor prophets. Future to us, there is going to be an emergence of 10 kingdoms. You say, which 10? I don't know. It's future to us, so not going to go there. But future to us, there's going to be 10 kingdoms that are going to set up for a very short amount of time. And then what Daniel says is, where do we go? Verse 44, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And so in that future time, even to us, I mean, this was all future to Nebuchadnezzar, but in that time that is yet future to us, in the days of those 10 kings that we don't know yet, God is going to set up a kingdom, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So God's going to set up a kingdom, and Jesus is going to set up a millennial kingdom, and that kingdom is going to continue through the millennium, and it's going to continue all the way into the eternal state, and it's just never going to end. It is going to consume and take over the entire earth, and all of the kingdoms of men are going to be swept away. That hasn't happened yet. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So, king, just in case you weren't sure, I told you the dream. Here's the interpretation, and I'm not guessing. This is absolutely what God said is going to happen. And so we look at, the reason that we can break out what the pieces of this image were that Nebuchadnezzar saw is because they fit with history as we see it. We're not fitting history to that. It's an actual, God said this is what's going to happen, and we can look back at history and we can see it happening all the way along. And so the parts of this that are still future to us, are they just as sure as the parts of it that are past to us? Yeah, because the dream is sure, and the interpretation is sure. This is what God has said is going to happen. It has happened, much of it. The rest of it still will happen. Pretty exciting dream, don't you think? Now, I put in your notes there kind of a quick snapshot of everything I just said because I don't want you trying to write it all down and remember it later. It's important, but it's not actually all that important. And I'll tell you why in a second. So we'll keep reading verse 46. Strangely enough, not strangely enough perhaps, Daniel turns the tide on Nebuchadnezzar's anger. Nebuchadnezzar gets the interpretation of his dream, which he wanted to know. And it's not actually a bad one for him. This is not a good, it's a good thing for him. God said, you're pretty awesome. When God says you're awesome, that's a good day. So he gets the interpretation, and he knows it's right because Daniel told him what the dream was in the first place. And so Nebuchadnezzar's response here, his reaction, is very interesting. Look at verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel. Now, how often do you think Nebuchadnezzar bowed to anybody? Ever. How about never? He's the emperor. People bow to him. He has taken over kingdom after kingdom after kingdom, and kings have prostrated themselves before him. He is undefeated, though. No time has he had to bow himself prostrate before anyone. And his reaction to Daniel is that he comes off his throne and he gets onto his face in front of Daniel. Prostrates himself down. And he commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. Guess what Nebuchadnezzar's doing? He's having church. Of course, at this point, he thinks that Daniel is something to worship. He's a little misguided, but Daniel set him straight, don't worry. The king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is the God of gods. Do we know that? Yeah. The Lord of lords, the King of kings. Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Nebuchadnezzar is genuinely impressed, and here's a guy who doesn't impress easily. Genuinely impressed, acknowledging the superiority of Daniel's God compared to all the other gods that he was familiar with. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. And so Daniel gets this great promotion. He's going to be now the administrator of the city, the province of Babylon. I mean, this is like, the Babylonian Empire. This is their capital. And he says, you're going to rule the capital province. I mean, this is usually the one place where the king pays a little bit of attention and he gets people to administrate the other provinces. He says, no, you're going to administrate this province. You're going to take over part of my job. He says, and I'm going to make you ruler over all the wise men, all the astrologers, all the soothsayers, all the king's counselors. Anybody who is in the king's court, they all now answer to you. You answer to me. Everything else answers to you. Nebuchadnezzar's like, you know what? You're pretty smart. I'll give you the whole province to administrate that, and I'll give you all the wise men. You rule over them, and you advise me. That's not a bad promotion, right? I mean, you just put in charge of everything, basically. But he wasn't done yet. Also, Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. And so Daniel didn't forget his three friends. Here's the guys who met with him. Here's the three guys who prayed with him. Here was the three guys who were probably praying for him while he stood before the king to give the interpretation. And he said, now I've got these three guys in mind to help me administrate the city. Is that going to be okay? And of course, Nebuchadnezzar's like, whatever works for you, works for me. And so Daniel is actually, he's in charge of the province of Babylon, but he takes his three friends and he puts them as administrators over the city. They're administrating the capital city so that Daniel can focus the majority of his attention to Nebuchadnezzar. Sure, he'll run it. Sure, he'll do administrative stuff. But on the day-to-day basis, he wants his focus to be the king. And so, these three guys now, so they've gone from sons of nobles in a vassal kingdom to being schooled in Babylon to now they're administrating the capital province. And Daniel stands before the king all day, every day. Not doing too badly. Not doing too badly at all. And this story, like a lot of the stories in the book of Daniel, is absolutely amazing. I know it's a little bit long, but it's absolutely amazing. But the importance of this particular story has nothing to do with the prophecy. And that's why I tried to put it in your notes on the back of your program, so you didn't have to think about it, you didn't have to worry about it, because as interesting as it is, it's not all that important to this particular story. Yes, it's a rollout of history, big deal. But the part of it that really matters to us is the part that we probably missed. Because like so many things in life, the most important moments oftentimes pass by without much fanfare. Looking back, you go, well, that was huge. That was a watershed moment in my life. I didn't even realize it at the time. But that was very important. And that's the same thing that happened with us here in Daniel. So let me invite your attention back to verse 17 and show you what was actually really important in this story. Joshua will see if he can find it. I didn't give it to him, so it's my fault, not his. But in verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, the decision that they were going to die, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Of all of the verses in Daniel chapter 2, those two are actually the important ones. And they're important for this because they show us how Daniel responded and reacted to a life-threatening situation. Daniel Daniel resisted the temptation to panic. Instead, he prayed, believing that God would answer. And that's what all of chapter 2 hinges right there on, that little detail. That Daniel didn't panic. I mean, everybody else was panicking. All of the other king's advisors, they were freaking out of their minds. They were scared to death. They were running. They were hiding. They were panicking. They were begging for time. They were begging for their life. They were panicking at every turn because they knew they were going to die. And Daniel said, I'm not going to panic. Sure, this is life-threatening. It's not that he didn't take the situation seriously. You can take something seriously without freaking out about it. He didn't panic. Instead, he prayed, believing God would give him the answer. That's hugely important to us. I know that's not the greatest English in the world, but get it. That's important to us because do you ever face situations in your life that you feel like they're life-threatening? Whether they are or not may not be relevant. They feel life-threatening. They feel like, my goodness, the sky is falling. My life is over. How am I ever going to move on from this? This is like the worst thing I could possibly imagine. I'm coming completely undone. Have you ever faced a scenario like that in your life? And I see a lot of you nodding your head yes. If you're not nodding your head yes, then buckle up, baby, because it's coming. And what is our instinct in those moments? Our instinct, and we're hardwired, right? Fight or flight. Guess what both of those instincts are? They are panic. No matter which of those things that we are hardwired to choose, it's panic. It takes a lot of discipline in that moment to step back and say, I am neither going to fight nor flee. I'm going to pray. And not just pray, but pray believing God will give me the answer. Praying that God will give me the provision of whatever it is I need in this moment. Well, let's face it. Telling you what somebody else dreamed, that's not an easy request to ask for, is it? God, open up their mind to me. Let me see what they dreamed. How many of you have ever prayed that? Nobody in this room has ever prayed that because it's insane. Nobody normal prays that because how could God possibly do that? Open up somebody's head and tell you what somebody else dreamed. Could God do that? Yeah, he can without even breaking a sweat. But it definitely falls into the category of things too big to ask for us, doesn't it, from our perspective? And so the whole story hinges on the fact that Daniel and his friends resisted the temptation to panic, and instead they prayed believing that God would give them the answer. And as a result of that faith, as a result of that reaction and that response, as a result of the fact that they didn't panic but they did pray, guess what happened? They got promoted again. All of the guys who panicked, all of the guys who had the power, who were running around like collectively with no, chickens with no heads, and some of them actually did have no heads, but anyway. Guess who they now answer to? The one guy who says, I'm not going to panic, I'm going to pray. I'm not giving in to temptation, and I'm not going to do it your way, I'm going to do it the right way. Because as the child of God, what is the right response? It's prayer. And what we find again, and it's a reminder that we need to keep having hammered into us, me especially, I'm assuming you do too, is that when I do things the way God said do them, things work out best. Not even better, best. If I refuse to panic and instead I'll pray, believing that God has, it's not enough to pray. You got to pray believing that God will give me the answer. Not only will God give me the answer, but he'll put me into that role of the undefeated that says, you may experience setbacks, but you're going to win because you've done it the right way. We're so tempted to take shortcuts in life, aren't we? We're so tempted to try to live our lives the same way everybody else is living their lives. But what it shows you as we read through these stories is that the way that everybody else is living their lives doesn't work. Why would you want to live your life that way if you know it doesn't work? Why would you want to chase the dreams that other people have if they don't work? Why would you want to set your priorities the same way that other people set their priorities if they don't work? Daniel said, I'm not panicking. I'm not going to do what you do. I'm going to pray. It's the one thing you won't do, but it's the right thing to do. And ultimately, Daniel kept rising. Every time you think it's not possible for a captive to rise any higher, he does. Because he prays, he trusts God, and he doesn't panic. And he won't do it the way they do it. And he's undefeated. Father, I love you. I thank you for Daniel and for his friends and the testimony they have. Lord, I thank you for this passage. Lord, it's so easy for us to get bogged down in the prophecy and miss the real importance. That's simple, but hard. Father, we all face difficult situations in our life. There's really no way around that. It's going to happen. Father, would you help us to see in Daniel a pattern that we ought to follow? To not panic, but rather to hit our knees, praying, believing that you can and you will answer. Help us to trust you. Help us to be undefeated simply because we do it right and we refuse to do it the way everybody else does. That doesn't work. Help us, we pray, in Jesus' good name.